Part 1. The Lie Behind the Portrait. Look at any royal portrait. What you see is perfection, divine lineage, immaculate bloodlines, rulers sculpted by destiny itself. These were the people meant to stand above ordinary humanity. Power, wealth, the illusion of superiority painted onto canvas. But that image is a lie. Europe's most dominant royal dynasty didn't fall because of enemies or rebellion. They collapsed from inside, devoured by their own obsession with pure blood. Their final king, Charles II of Spain, was the living proof of what happens when a dynasty tries to bend biology to its will. He couldn't close his mouth. He couldn't chew. His body struggled with the most basic functions. His mother recoiled the moment she saw him, not out of cruelty, but instinctive shock. Yet before this child became a medical impossibility, before his jaw jutted so far he drooled constantly, he was the heir to one of the largest empires on earth. This is one of history's clearest demonstrations of what happens when genetic boundaries are pushed past the breaking point. Modern DNA analysis revealed something unbelievable. Charles II was more inbred than the child of a brother and sister. What follows is a story as tragic as it is terrifying. How the Habsburgs turned their own bodies into a biological catastrophe. Part 2. A Birth Marked by Horror. Our story begins on November 6, 1661, inside a dim chamber of Madrid's royal palace. Midwives lifted the newborn prince and immediately knew something was wrong. His head was unnaturally large, his breathing shallow and ragged. History books soften what happened next, but eyewitness accounts don't. Queen Mariana, the baby's mother, flinched at the sight of her son and refused to nurse him. This wasn't coldness, it was shock, it was recognition. Because Mariana wasn't just his mother, she was also his aunt and cousin. How is that possible? Because Charles's father, King Philip IV, married his own niece. The Habsburg family tree didn't branch outward, it looped endlessly into itself. To understand why Charles came into the world already broken, we need to travel back to the moment the dynasty discovered its dark formula for maintaining power. Part 3. The Dynasty of Closed Blood. The Habsburgs had a motto: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." Romantic words hiding a disturbing reality. For nearly 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs married inside their own bloodline. Cousins, uncles, nieces, even double cousins. Not distant relations, but people who shared grandparents or parents. They called it preserving purity. Modern science calls it genetic suicide. Here's the shocking number. Over 80% of their marriages were between close relatives. By the time Charles II was born, all of his 8 great-grandparents descended from the same royal couple. Charles didn't inherit a family. He inherited a genetic loop. His inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 was higher than what occurs in children born from sibling incest. But statistics don't capture the human cost. Let's return to Charles, an infant already fighting for life. Part 4. A Body Failing from the Start. Baby Charles could barely suckle. His mouth was already misshapen, his skull unfused. Wet nurses reported that he almost never cried, not because he was calm, but because he lacked the strength. He lay pale and motionless, his enormous head sagging to one side.
The finest doctors in Spain were helpless. They had never seen an infant so fragile. As he grew, the truth of his condition emerged, and it only grew more disturbing. At 4 years old, Charles still could not walk, not even a few steps. His legs bowed from severe rickets. Servants carried him everywhere in special chairs. Worse still, he couldn't speak. His tongue, already abnormally large, filled his mouth. His lower jaw thrust forward so dramatically that his lips could not close. By the time he did utter words, they were slurred and soaked in saliva. Attendants followed him with cloths to wipe away the constant drool. Imagine a child whose mouth could never fully close, whose tongue had nowhere to rest, whose every attempt to speak became an ordeal. Foreign diplomats wrote letters describing him as nearly indescribable, his jaw so prominent it looked like a second face. And eating? Eating was a nightmare. Charles II swallowed every bite whole. He could not chew. His teeth never met. Meals had to be liquefied or minced into tiny fragments so he could gulp them down. This was the future king of Spain.
Part 5. A childhood of illness and decline. Charles's physical deformities were only the beginning. By the time he reached childhood, his body had become a battleground. Every major illness that drifted through the palace struck him with devastating force. Measles nearly killed him at 6. Chickenpox left deep scars, rubella, then smallpox, the worst of all. At 9 years old, Charles lay close to death for weeks, his already distorted face swollen with pustules. When he survived, the ordeal left permanent damage. Doctors observed something far more alarming. Fluid was accumulating inside his skull. Today, we call it hydrocephalus, water on the brain. In the 17th century, it was simply another curse upon the prince. The pressure brought migraines so severe he sometimes screamed through the night. His vision blurred, his balance worsened, and the swelling inside his skull stole yet another part of his development. By age 10, the royal tutors were in despair, not because Charles refused to learn, but because he simply could not retain information. Lessons evaporated from his memory as soon as they were taught. Basic arithmetic confused him. Languages eluded him entirely. One tutor recorded privately, "I teach him with patience, but the next day he remembers nothing. He sits and stares at the air as though his thoughts do not exist." Charles wasn't stupid. His body and mind were failing him at the cellular level, and puberty would bring even greater tragedy. Part 6. The King Who Could Never Become a Man. When other princes entered adolescence, their bodies changed. Charles's did not. His voice never deepened. His body hair barely emerged. His growth stalled. He remained trapped in a childlike state, physically and hormonally, long past the age when a king was expected to father heirs. The royal court panicked. Spain ruled massive territories across Europe and the Americas, and everything depended on Charles producing a child. But the young king showed no romantic interest in anyone, not women, not men, nothing. He didn't understand sexuality. His body couldn't respond to it. Still, the kingdom demanded an heir. So, at 18, Charles was married to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a beautiful, intelligent French princess known for her charm and grace. Their wedding was a disturbing contrast. She walked tall, radiant, elegant. He shuffled down the aisle, hunched and frail, assisted by attendants. When the ceremony ended, everyone prayed for a miracle. What happened instead was political catastrophe.
On their wedding night and every night thereafter, Charles proved completely incapable of consummating the marriage. Not unwilling, physically incapable. Marie-Louise, compassionate and patient, tried everything. Medical treatments grew more humiliating by the year. She drank potions. He consumed ground pearls, bull's blood, even a mixture containing a dried stag's penis. Nothing worked, because nothing could work. Charles's reproductive organs were as malformed as the rest of his body. Part 7. Desperation turns to superstition. As years passed without a pregnancy, the pressure became suffocating. Doctors examined Marie-Louise repeatedly, hoping the fault lay with her. But she was perfectly healthy. All eyes turned to the king. His mother, Queen Mariana, desperate for a grandchild, turned to superstition. Priests were summoned, then mystics, then well-known miracle healers. One holy man suggested Charles's impotence was the result of a curse, and so began one of the darkest episodes in royal history. Charles II, King of Spain, ruler of an empire stretching across oceans, was made to sleep beside holy relics, hoping sacred energy would restore his manhood. When that failed, they escalated. Queen Mariana arranged for Charles to sleep beside exhumed corpses, the bodies of saints, dead royals, even his own father. Officials placed decaying bodies in his chamber, believing contact with the holy dead would revive his fertility. Imagine it, a deformed king lying in a cold bed, drooling uncontrollably, positioned beside a corpse, all in the desperate hope of producing an heir. 10 years passed, 10 years of humiliation, 10 years of failure. Then, at only 26 years old, Marie-Louise died suddenly. The official cause? Appendicitis. Rumors whispered poison. Others whispered despair. Whatever the truth, Charles was shattered. Despite everything, he had loved the only person who had ever shown him gentleness. Part 8. A second marriage, a kingdom in collapse. Marie-Louise's death left Spain in mourning, but for the royal court, grief quickly turned to calculation. Charles was still young enough that, if a miracle ever occurred, an heir might yet be born. So within months, a second marriage was arranged. This time, the bride was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess whose family was famous for one thing: producing daughters who were extremely fertile. If anyone could give Spain an heir, it was her. Maria Anna arrived expecting to be queen. She had no idea she was stepping into a living nightmare. From the moment she met her new husband, the shock was overwhelming. She saw a man who looked decades older than his age, sunken cheeks, trembling hands, skin almost gray, and eyes that drifted in different directions, struggling to focus. He moved stiffly, as if every joint were locked in pain. He spoke slowly, drooling, unable to pronounce half the words. Yet the entire weight of Spain's destiny had been placed on this broken body. Maria Anna hid her horror, but it never left her. And soon she too realized the truth. Charles was incapable of fathering a child. The palace doctors, clergy, and advisors insisted the couple continue trying, month after month, year after year, performing humiliating treatments and rituals. None of it mattered. Spain's hope was dying. But something far more dangerous was happening inside Charles himself. Part 9. The decline of the last Habsburg. By his early 30s, Charles's condition had become unmanageable. His limbs grew weaker. His speech slurred further. He had episodes where he simply collapsed, paralyzed and unable to move for hours. He lost his teeth one by one until he could barely chew food. His eyesight dimmed. His hearing faded. Even his skull changed shape, the hydrocephalus worsening with age. Foreign ambassadors began sending letters home describing the monarch in horrific detail. The king is unable to walk without assistance. His body appears to be melting away. He does not sleep. He wanders the palace at night, trembling like a frightened child. His face is ghastly. It is a wonder that such a man still lives. But the most disturbing change wasn't physical. It was mental. Charles began having hallucinations. He believed he was cursed. He heard voices. He became convinced that witches were attacking his body and stealing his strength. Priests performed exorcisms, not once, not twice, several times. The King of Spain was treated not as a sick man, but as a vessel of demonic influence. The truth was far more tragic. Charles's brain was breaking down. Generations of inbreeding had formed a genetic trap, one that would inevitably collapse. By 1699, when Charles was 38, his condition deteriorated at a terrifying pace. His body swelled, his abdomen filled with fluid, his legs wasted away until they were just bone. He could no longer walk, he could barely speak. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and yet the court still demanded clarity from him, because without an heir, the Spanish Empire, one of the largest in human history, faced total fragmentation.
Part 10. The Last Days. In the final year of his life, Charles II weighed less than 45 kilograms. His skin was yellow. He vomited blood. His body produced almost no heat. Attendants wrapped him in layers of furs just to keep him alive. Doctors were horrified. One physician wrote, "His body is a ruin. His heart is weak, his lungs diseased, his intestines rotted, his stomach unable to digest. His liver does not function. The man is dead, though still breathing." Charles spent his last months drifting between delirium and brief moments of clarity. In one of those rare moments, he signed his final will, naming a successor outside the Habsburg family. It was the one decision he ever made alone. It would spark a global conflict. Because when Charles died on November 1, 1700, at just 38 years old, Spain was left without an heir. Europe erupted into chaos. The War of the Spanish Succession began, a conflict that would reshape the world map. All because one man, a man who should never have been born, was forced to carry the weight of an empire. Charles II was not a tyrant, not a villain, not a fool. He was a victim, a symbol of a dynasty that pushed genetics to its breaking point. And his tragic story became the final chapter of the Habsburg Empire's greatest curse. Part 11. Aftermath and Historical Impact. When Charles II took his final breath, Spain was not merely mourning a king, it was standing at the edge of a geopolitical earthquake. For 2 centuries, the Habsburg Empire had dominated Europe. But with Charles gone and no heir to inherit the throne, the map of the continent suddenly shattered. Every major power, France, Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, saw an opening to seize Spain's global empire. The war that changed the world. Within weeks of Charles's death, troops mobilized, alliances were formed, crowns sharpened their ambitions like blades. The War of the Spanish Succession began, one of the largest conflicts of the 18th century. Cities burned across Europe. Armies clashed from Italy to the Netherlands. Even the American colonies were dragged into the chaos. Tens of thousands died, and at the heart of the storm was a sick king whose body had collapsed under the weight of inbred bloodlines. A dynasty ends. For centuries, the Habsburgs had believed their blood was sacred, so sacred that it could never mix with outsiders. But their quest for purity created the opposite, a lineage so genetically fragile that it could no longer support life.
Charles II became the final symbol of a collapsing dynasty. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended forever. The empire he inherited was carved apart. Territories were traded like game pieces. Nations rose and fell. And historians today still point to Charles's tragic life as the moment the old world began to crumble, when royal bloodlines became monuments to their own destruction. Part 12. Modern Scientific Analysis. Centuries later, scientists began to investigate the mystery behind Charles II's extreme deformities, infertility, and cognitive decline. And what they discovered was even more devastating than the rumors of curses and witchcraft. The inbreeding coefficient. Geneticists calculated Charles's inbreeding coefficient, the percentage of his DNA that was identical because his parents shared ancestors. For most people, 0.3%. For Charles II, over 25%. That number is staggering. The kind of genetic overlap you'd expect if someone were the child of a brother and sister. But Charles wasn't the product of one incestuous pairing. He was the result of 200 years of continuous intermarriage inside the same royal bloodline. His genes collapsed under the pressure. The diseases behind the legend. Modern researchers believe Charles suffered from two major genetic disorders at the same time. 1. Combined pituitary hormone deficiency. Explains his stunted growth, childlike voice, lack of puberty, infertility. 2. Distal renal tubular acidosis. Explains his weak bones, chronic illness, swollen abdomen, constant infections, eventual organ failure. Together, these conditions would have made survival into adulthood nearly impossible. The fact that Charles lived to 38 is a medical puzzle in itself. No curse, just science. For centuries, people whispered that Charles was bewitched, cursed, even possessed. But the truth is colder and far more tragic. He was dying from a genetic prison built by his own dynasty. His body was the final warning, a biological alarm signaling the end of a bloodline that had pushed nature far beyond its limits. The legacy. Today, Charles II stands not as a monstrous figure, but as a symbol of what happens when power is valued more than human well-being. His story taught monarchies a brutal lesson. No throne is worth the destruction of a lineage. No dynasty survives a war against biology. And with him, the Habsburgs learned it too late. Part 13. Closing narration. Final dramatic ending. The story of Charles II is not merely the tale of a fallen king. It is the final echo of a dynasty that defied nature for too long. For generations, the Habsburgs believed their bloodline was unbreakable, that their crowns, their wealth, their divine right could shield them from the limits of the human body. But nature does not bow to thrones, nor does biology obey kings. In the cold chambers of the Escorial Palace, surrounded by relics, superstition, and fear, the last Habsburg monarch struggled just to stay alive. A man whom history labeled the bewitched, not because of demons, but because his body had become a battlefield between legacy and genetics. His life was a series of battles he could never win, against illness, against expectation, against a kingdom that demanded the impossible from them. And so an empire collapsed, not with an explosion, but with a whisper, a weak heartbeat, a final breath, a crown slipping from the head of a king who never had the strength to wear it. Charles II left behind no heir, no lasting reforms, no grand victories, but he left behind something greater, a warning carved into the pages of history. When power isolates itself, when dynasties lock their bloodlines shut, when pride outruns wisdom, the fall that follows is absolute. In the end, Charles was not a monster, nor a madman. He was a victim of forces far older than any empire, the fragile architecture of the human genome. His death marked the twilight of a royal house and the rise of a new Europe forged through war and rebirth. This was the final chapter of the Habsburgs' greatest curse, a curse created not by magic, but by man. And the legacy of Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, endures as a haunting reminder that even the most powerful empires can crumble under the weight of their own blood.
Don't forget to like the video and leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel so you'll be the first to know when new videos drop.